So I put together this presentation on the COVID impacts on electric utilities. I presented it in a couple of forums, and it's it's not what I expected. There've been a lot of different impacts. Commercial and industrial sales are definitely lower. Residential sales are definitely higher. Fuel and purchase power costs are definitely lower. Utilities cost of capital is lower because interest rates have collapsed. Utilities are carrying higher balances of unpaid bills, and those may create a problem if they're not recoverable. And the impacts are quite different on decoupled utilities versus non-decoupled utilities. This is a graphic of US electricity sales by month with this year through August. At the beginning of the year, residential sales were slightly below what they had been last year and the year before, shown in orange and blue. But since the stay home, stay healthy orders began in April, and continuing through the summer, residential sales have been noticeably higher than last year and the year before. The opposite is true for commercial electricity sales. They were running pretty close to last year and the year before in January and February, but are definitely significantly below what they were. And I suspect when the current November, December stay home and stay healthy orders are observed in the states, that we'll see drop off again. Industrial sales have been even more dramatically down maybe 15% below what they were last year and the year before, which is pretty dramatic. But when you take it all together, with the exception of the shutdown months, total sales have been really quite close. As the residential increase is mostly offsetting the commercial and industrial sales decrease. This is a graphic from a report that Brattle Group has done on the COVID impacts, and I'll make a pitch for their report at the end of this presentation. This looks at the average load in all 7 of the ISOs, from ISO New England to the California ISO, for the period February through September. And they use the ISO loads because the reporting and data availability is better. And it showed significant total load reductions, except for the summer months of July and August, where total sales were a little higher. And that's consistent with the national data that I showed from US EIA. Natural gas prices are lower. This is the Henry Hub natural gas price. It came up to equal last year in August. That was primarily because of extreme hot weather in Texas and California that caused a lot of additional gas use for electric generation, putting pressure on the gas market. But there are other reasons we'll expect upward gas price pressure going forward, mostly that the amount of drilling activity has dropped rather dramatically, and that will likely result in a tighter market in the year to come. But through this year, the gas prices have been lower, and gas is the swing generating fuel for nearly all of the US. Oil prices were also lower for the few places that still use oil for electricity generation. The load shapes across the ISOs have generally improved, but the August and September peaks, in particular the September peaks, were very high. And they were very high because of high residential air conditioning usage. Brattle put together this collection of wholesale prices for all of the ISOs, and the dots are previous year, and the years, and the bars are this year. It's a little bit of a busy graphic, but at the very top in the red boxes, you see the percentage decline in wholesale prices in September versus the 2-year historical average. And in every ISO, the averages were down anywhere from 13% in Southwest Power Pool South to 64% in ERCOT North. This means that the wholesale cost of power to utilities that are buying power in the market or have contracts indexed to market prices are down pretty significantly. In states that have full flow through of fuel and purchase power costs, this should have no impact on utility net income, but many states have partial pass-through or incentive regulation type fuel and purchase power clauses, and where the utility retains a portion of the savings or bears a portion of the cost increases. And for those utilities, these lower power prices will mean higher net income. I use just one power price for the very rough illustrative analysis that I'm about to show, and I chose ISO New England, Connecticut. Their power price about 2.5 cents, just about exactly the same as the average across the country. Maybe the average across the country was a little bit lower than that, down in the 2-cent range. But I use this particular figure of about 25 cents a kilowatt hour as for an illustration. And it's just an illustration of what is the impact on the total utility gross margin. I use the term gross margin in the gas utility sense. It is the retail revenue minus the variable cost of the energy supply. This illustration takes into account from last year to this year that rates have changed, that wholesale costs have changed, that sales have changed, that the margin over wholesale cost therefore changes. And just to walk through the calculation for one sector, I start with, in this case, the residential sales for a period. This is April through August. The average retail rate that comes from USEIA, the wholesale power cost. This is where I use just a single data point, and that's approximately right, but precisely very, very wrong. Varies by region. And the difference between the two, the average rate and the wholesale power cost is the residential margin. Multiply that by the sales, and you get what is the residential income. So here I've now done this calculation for residential, commercial, and industrial sales. And in each case, it's the bottom line number takes into account the change in sales, the change in rates, the change in wholesale power costs. Residential income over power costs up from $64 billion to $72 billion. Commercial down from 48 to 46. Industrial down from 18 to 17. The important thing here is that the commercial and industrial margin per kilowatt hour is much lower than that for residential because the rates are lower and the wholesale power cost is about the same. But when you add all three sectors together, the increase in residential margin exceeds the decrease in commercial and industrial margin. So you wind up with the total margin for the electricity sector being higher than it was in 2019 by about 4%. That was a surprise to me. I'm now going to turn to the cost of capital impacts that have been experienced since the COVID crisis began. One of the primary bits of data used in cost of capital analysis is the 1-year US Treasury bond rate, what we call the risk-free rate of return. That has dropped from almost 3% a year ago to only around 0.1% today. Extremely sharp drop in interest rates, and nearly all of that drop, about 100 basis points of it, happens right here in March when the crisis hit. And the Fed began flooding the capital markets with money, depressing interest rates. Electric utility bond interest rates have also dropped. They were running a year ago, 2 years ago, they were up around almost 5%. A year ago, they were down to about 3.5%. They're now down to 2.5% for interest on bonds issued by electric utilities. So better than 100 basis point decline there. There was a pretty serious hiccup early in the crisis when the markets were terrified of what was going to happen. Were there going to be business failures? And while the stock market prices crashed, bond interest rates soared very, very briefly. That would have been a great time to buy bond funds in your IRA. Bradl looked at this in a pretty disciplined fashion. This graphic shows the change in second quarter earnings. Across zero is up here for a whole bunch of different industry sectors. The S&P 500 is a group down about 30%. Industrials down 80%. Energy companies, meaning oil and gas producers, down into the negative range. But electric utilities were one of very few sectors that actually showed an increase in net earnings. And I think this is because residential sales were up and wholesale power costs and fuel costs were down. And the interesting thing was that the utility earnings grew by about 9% in the second quarter. Really quite dramatic. Because they are essential services, utilities have been a lot better insulated from general economic conditions than other sectors of the economy. So what's happened to the stock market? Well, everything crashed in the end of March. The S&P 500 recovered quite quickly back into record territory. The utility index, here in blue, did not recover. And when I actually put this presentation together, I saw this data. I dug a little deeper into it, and I invested all of the idle cash in my IRA into utility stocks that I thought would do particularly well. I only left the money there for a few weeks because I made about a 10% return. They recovered back up to near parity with the S&P 500 very, very quickly. So I had I'm now divested of all of those stocks. I didn't have any conflicts when I made the investment. I still don't, but I feel like I should disclose here what I did when I saw this data. It made me think that utilities were a good buy, so I bought them. The next subject is the billing deferrals. 2/3 of the states adopted shut-off moratoriums. About half of the states still have those in effect, and that half of the states has more than half of the population of the country. Big states like California, New York, Pennsylvania, included in the moratoriums. Other states have had, all voluntary moratoria with greater or lesser encouragement. Lots of residential, commercial, and industrial customers have not been paying their bills. In the commercial sector, there may be no hope of recovering those costs from the customers that haven't paid them because lots of those businesses have ceased operation. More than 100,000 restaurants have closed in the United States during this crisis. Most are not expected to reopen. So those may be permanent losses. The question is, will states allow the utilities to recover these uncollectible bills through a surcharge on other customers? And I think the answer is that where the state ordered the moratorium, it's 99% certain that recovery will be allowed. Where utilities implemented moratoriums on their own, maybe 90% probability they'll be recovered. I think it is extremely likely that utilities will be allowed to recover these deferrals over the next couple of years. There will be a few that will be turned down, I'm sure, but probably not very many. Decoupled utilities are in a very different situation than non-decoupled. About half of the states have one or more of their electric utilities with decoupling, including very populous states in the Northeast and the West. Decoupled utilities generally are guaranteed to recover the amount of revenue or distribution margin or some other measure of cost, regardless of sales changes in sales volumes. Most of these were put in place to insulate the utilities from adverse impacts due to energy efficiency programs. But most of these programs were designed so that they actually insulate the utility from sales variation due to any cause. What's interesting is that in a few states, utilities requested and regulators approved, leaving the industrial customers out of the decoupling mechanism. In those states, the higher sales from residential customers will only result in decreased rates for the classes that are participating in the decoupling mechanism. And the utilities will simply lose the margin from the lower industrial sales. But in most states where all of the sales are covered and the utility is assured recovery of its allowed revenue from whatever class, based on whatever the actual sales are. Hawaii and California are good examples of this. Utilities will be allowed to net residential gains against the industrial losses. And if there is a net loss, they'll be allowed to recover that. And if there's a net gain, they'll have to rebate that. I had an interesting experience with a utility from Canada, Electra, which serves the municipalized areas in Ontario. And they have a pretty interesting problem. And I'll touch on that when we get into the rate design part of it. They're not decoupled, but they do have straight fixed variable residential rate making. So as we talk about the rate design impacts, in residential class, sales have increased. Utilities that recover their residential revenue primarily through volumetric rates have generated additional revenue, additional margin, additional net income. Those with high fixed charges have suppressed their opportunity for revenue gain in periods of sales gain. This is what happened in Ontario, is their residential rate design is like $35 a month fixed charge, and only the cost of power then flows through in a variable charge. They were not able to gain any additional revenue from the residential sales, which are about 10%. But in that case of that Ontario group, their industrial sales are still tied to sales volumes, and those sales volumes declined. So they lost money on the industrial side. They were not able to make it up on the residential side. They were made much worse off by virtue of their high fixed charge rate design. Time of use rates have had pretty mixed impacts across the country. In solar rich regions, where there's lots of power in the middle of the day, that power has normally, a lot of that power has been used by commercial customers, office buildings, retailers. And those loads are way down. So they're kind of glutted with power at midday, and that's creating some interesting problems. And residential loads have increased, and that increase, as I showed the load shapes earlier, has had much higher late afternoon, early evening loads than before. The business loads are suppressed in the middle of the day when solar is plentiful, and residential loads are higher in the evening when it's scarce. So those places, the traditional TOU rates have had kind of an adverse impact. In the traditional daytime peaking regions, the TOU rates have resulted in a great deal of lost revenue from the commercial sector. If the rates are lower in the evening, that's not being made up by higher sales to residential customers in the evening. I haven't done an analysis utility by utility. There's only a few utilities that have all or nearly all of their customers on TOU rates. It'll be next year before we have monthly data from those utilities to be able to look at the actual impacts on the utilities. In the commercial sales sector, it's a different story. The total sales have decreased. Utilities that have what we call demand charge ratchets have generated pretty stable revenue. Demand charge ratchets are a form of a demand charge where your billing demand for each month is equal to your actual maximum usage in that month, or a defined percentage of your maximum usage rate during the previous year, typically 75%. So if an industrial customer reduced their usage by 50%, their demand charge would still be recovered at 75% of its historical level. That has created a lot of consumer hostility. It's also created an inefficient response, and I'll show that in just a minute. Where commercial customers are on TOU rates, that has generated a more efficient response. I'm now going to show one particular customer. This happens to be a large hotel in the Seattle area of usage across 1 week during the COVID crisis. The blue line was their usage in that week a year ago, with the usage going down overnight and then up when the guest rooms are active and down again overnight. So an up and down shape across the week. The red line is that hotel's usage this year in the same week. Almost a straight line. What's going on? Well, the hotel has to flow dehumidified air into the unoccupied rooms to keep them from getting moldy. But it has only 3 floors occupied in operation and 7 floors that are mothballed because they have such low guest count. So what they're doing is when guest room usage is up, they reduce the flow of air into the mothballed rooms. And when the guest room use of the active floors is up, it is not down, they then increase the flow of air into the mothballed rooms. And by doing that, they're able to produce an absolutely flat, nearly absolutely flat load shape. It just happens to be set at the level of their demand ratchet. They're going to pay for this 420 kW of demand, whether they use it or not. So their incentive of the rate design is to levelize their usage. Well, that's not actually what we want them to do. If they're in a solar-rich region and the price of power is low in the middle of the day and high in the evening, we would want them to use more power in the middle of the day and less power in the evening. That is, not to have a flat load shape. If they're in a thermal-based region, the cost of power is low overnight and high in the daytime, and we would want them to use more power overnight and less in the daytime. The demand charge ratchet gives them a perverse incentive to levelize their usage when the economic response would be to concentrate that usage. But we're definitely seeing customers respond to their demand ratchets as they're trying to manage their business operations during the crisis. I'll summarize this very quickly. Residential sales are up, commercial and industrial sales are down, the net is down a little bit. The revenue net of power costs, residential is up sharply, commercial and industrial down slightly, the net retail margins and profit for utilities up a little bit. Frankly, they're doing better than almost any other industry. Cost of capital is down sharply. The billing deferrals are up sharply, but those are likely to be recoverable. Finally, the recommended reading, this Brattle report, I thought was absolutely excellent. I recommend it to you on the impacts and implications of COVID-19 for the energy industry. It's not looking just at electricity, it's looking at electricity, natural gas, and petroleum. But really some great data in there, separate from the data that I pulled from public sources. So thanks for that, and happy to take on any questions you might have.
So Jim, this is Johnny.
Johnny?
Given that the utilities, I mean, they're very worried obviously about the non-payment by some customers, but they seem to be, at least superficially to me, in a position where they can still provide assistance to impacted customers from the COVID pandemic, right?
I think so. It varies dramatically from utility to utility.
Right.
I mean, you know, a utility, for example, like our utility, Puget Sound Energy, which is overwhelmingly residential in its load, should be in very good shape. I was on a webinar with women from Minnesota Power, where 75% of their load is heavy industrial, and it's down 30%. It's down more than their entire residential load. They're not going to have that kind of situation. So it will vary from utility to utility. In Washington State, we have utilities like Cowlitz PUD that are heavily industrial that may be in trouble, and utilities that are overwhelmingly residential, particularly the municipal utilities. Should be in great shape.
Is there a difference between very large and very small? I'm thinking like Chelan versus Okanagan, if you were to look at
I don't think large versus small matters. I think what matters is what is the character of their load.
Okay.
And you know, if they have a lot of industrial load, they could be in trouble. If they have a lot of residential load, they should be just fine. And some of the industry, that's going to vary from industry to industry. You know, the food processing industry seems to be holding up very well. The paper industry is split. The tissue industry is doing just fine, but the specialty paper industry is not. So it's going to vary from utility to utility based on the character of their load.
So something I'm interested in your thoughts on is restructured regions, with basic server procurements, ISO transmission rates, and state regulated distribution rates. I think, well, some of it's different, but the distribution thing is the piece that people care about for most purposes, for at least for the health of the state regulated utilities. So I think a lot of that same stuff applies, but it's just the mix of volumetric versus demand charge, and then we have decoupling anyway in almost all the Northeast. So
yeah, well, so for the restructured regions, the residential margin is still much higher than the commercial and industrial margin. So if the commercial load and industrial load is down, the residential load, 1 kilowatt hour of residential sales growth can make up for 1.5 or 2 kilowatt hours of commercial or industrial load loss. So independent of the power cost piece of it, they should be doing well if they have kind of a normal load mix. At least in Texas, the retail, the distribution utilities, which are doing very, much like the New England utilities, are benefiting from the additional residential sales. But many of the retail electricity providers are owned by companies that also own distribution utilities. And so those retail electricity providers, whether they're unaffiliated with distribution companies as they are in New England, or often affiliated as they often are in Texas, those folks have 1 year or 2 year commitments or 6-month commitments from customers on price, and they're operating in a much lower cost power market. They're making money hand over fist on their default service or contract service power sales, because they, typically customers enter into a 1 year to 3 year agreement in Texas, and the retail electricity providers are now able to provide that power at a much lower price than they expected when the agreements were made. So they're doing great, and the default service suppliers in New England are able to provide power to customers in New England at lower costs than they expected. They should be doing great. And the decoupling mechanisms in some of the New England states do not include the industrial customers, but many of those customers have high demand charges with demand ratchets, and that's in essence a different form of decoupling, of isolating utility revenues from sales volumes. I suspect that the distribution utilities will all be doing fine, and the generation suppliers are doing terrific.
yeah, some of the basic service procurement is monthly for C&I, but then it's every 6 months for a lot of the residential, 6 months or a year for the residential. So sort of depends on the length of the overhang,
Right.
for the procurement length.